In your excellent article that you wrote with Emma Bonino in the Financial Times, you quote the European Treaty, which says that any aid granted by a member state which distorts or threatens to distort competition is incompatible with the common market. And you then say there should be committees at the level of the EU which would have to approve in advance state aids in Europe to the banking sector and the automobile sector. My question is, how do you persuade Mr. Sarkozy, Mr. Berlusconi in particular, who are somewhat skeptical of the EU to accept such a proposal? And should there be some attempt to coordinate state aids at the world level, perhaps through the World Trade Organization?
Well, if you think that it's impossible for me to convince Sarkozy and Berlusconi, don't ask me the other thing, because that's beyond imagination, I would say. No, I mean, there is a chance to convince Sarkozy and Berlusconi, also because the incompatibility of distortive state aids comes directly from the treaty, and the Commission already is empowered to prohibit them, to block them, even though decided by law. The Commission might, in this case, declare invalid national legislation if it contains these kinds of aids. Coordinating in national industrial policies in this moment might be useful to preempt the case, because if there is a coordination, and if they understand that by coordinating their efforts, let us take the case of the automobile. We perfectly know that independently of any other reasons, there are too many cars in all of our states, in Europe, and perhaps in the world. I don't know exactly that it applies also to global demand, but certainly in Europe we need fewer cars. So somehow the case of cars is similar to the case of steel several years ago. And perhaps even more than that, because we decided to reduce our capacity of steel production, ignoring the imminent Chinese demand of steel, which has changed the picture remarkably. But for sure, that kind of policy as to something that places a precedent now. So coordinating at the European level our policy toward cars might also mean how many green cars we need, and how many cars on the whole we expect. Of course, nothing similar to the steel plan of Davignon that set national quotas of production. This is something that belongs to the past. But having common guidelines might also lead to having aids that are not distortive, because aids are admissible. As long as they don't distort competition. And basically, in order not to distort competition, they have to be not discriminatory and to comply with the principle of proportionality. Things seem simple like this. It might make sense also at the global level. Why not? But this is what I had in mind in concluding my words before. If so much time has passed discussing about the reform of the international financial architecture, is it due to the fact that we are below standard vis-à-vis the issue, or is it due to the fact that the issue is above the standards of what we can do? So several human activities have globalized themselves much faster than we, on the other side of governance, of regulations, of public decisions making, can do. And therefore it is quite likely that there is an inexorable mismatch between the problems we have to face, the understanding we have of the problems, and the feasibility of envisaged but not feasible solutions for them. That's why I would be satisfied with an IMF, going back to the previous, that succeeds in restoring its typical job of surveillance, extended A, to all countries, and B, again, to monetary relationships. The future is not ours to see.
Okay. Yeah, Barry?
Barry Wood, Voice of America. What should the G7 and the G20 coming up do to alleviate the crisis? Maybe Fred would like to chime in on this too.
Easy question.
Well, I mean, what is necessary, I wouldn't have enormous expectations. Generally, these meetings are meetings where these gentlemen and few gentle ladies, generally fewer, meet each other, exchange their views, and perhaps prepare the lines of a possible coordination among them. I think that in these times, these meetings are extremely useful because it is for us extremely necessary to improve the level of our coordination, if what I said has some sort of sense. And in order for them to coordinate their actions, if they meet, this is better, and also if they commit themselves to sort of coordination. Extremely useful it is for them to pledge against protectionist measures. This is extremely important, and this is where the G20 is more important than the G7, because protectionist measures nowadays are most damaging for weaker countries. And we tend to forget about it, but protectionist measures might completely destroy the potential, which is already low, of some developing or not even yet developing countries. This is, in my view, this would be an excellent result. This already would be an excellent result. If they also succeed in putting the first elements for this improved global quasi-governance I was referring to, well, this again would be an excellent result, but don't expect the number of foreclosures in the States to get reduced because Obama saw Berlusconi, Sarkozy, and Putin. It doesn't change from this angle.
Very much in the spirit of what the Prime Minister said in responding to Barry, I would just add perhaps two more specifics. I totally agree that a pledge against protectionism is absolutely crucial right now. We've added up more than 30 countries have adopted new trade distortions since the G20 met in mid-November, and that number is rising all the time. The G20 made one mistake in its anti-protection pledge in November. They left a huge loophole by saying that the pledge only applied to protectionist measures that were illegal under the World Trade Organization. That leaves a tremendous scope for legal protectionism, since the rules are pretty porous. So I would submit this time they should agree on a comprehensive
exclusion of these measures.
Comprehensive agreement not to increase trade distortions of any type, whether or not legal under the international rules of the game, else there could be an enormous further erosion in that sense. The other thing, and I want to turn this into a question to you, Mr. Prime Minister, and this was, I think, really what President Obama had in mind this morning, I know Larry Summers and the economic team does, is to try to encourage substantial stimulus of domestic demand in all of the major countries that have not yet done so. I mean, the U.S. is just about to put a big program in place. China has announced one. I would submit that Europe is lagging. And so my question to you, do you agree with that? Do you think there is both a need for more expansionary fiscal measures in Europe, and if so, is that feasible? And would the process be promoted if we could get the G20 to agree to a commitment, say, that all major countries should expand domestic demand by at least 2% of GDP for each of the next 2 years?
Well, in principle, of course, I agree. Let me say that I'm a little, very candidly, on the basis of my personal experience, I tend to be skeptical about the solidity of the commitments that these guys take in these meetings in relation to domestic policies subsequently to be adopted. Because these are two different and not communicating words. The word of international meetings where all of us are free of domestic, let's say, constraints, and when we go back home. Sometimes it happens that at the end of the meetings, we said to each other, at least in my case, we said to each other, and now you go home and how much of what you have said here will remain? I don't know, was frequently the answer. I can imagine my prime minister pledging for an extraordinary expansion of the Italian economy under a strongest fiscal stimulus. Then he goes home, he meets Tremonti, and Tremonti says, there is not one single euro here because I'm already far above the Stability Pact with my debt. And if I have to spend more, therefore I should increase taxes. And when Berlusconi hears increasing taxes, he goes somewhere else, as many people do. Because there are countries with a high public debt which cannot afford more than a few 0-point-something of fiscal stimulus. And unhappily, the Commission took note of this fact because the communication that they delivered with their economic recovery plan was at least 1 point of GDP of fiscal stimulus, but those countries who have a high debt and imbalances, please, their priority is to take care of their imbalances. So it's not, it's not so easy. That's why I consider this one of the main challenges that we have to face, making Europe more productive and more capable of higher domestic consumption. But it's something that goes beyond the imminent meetings of our prime ministers, not to consider the impact of the enduring, let's say, viruses inside the financial system. Because the credit crunch is still there, liquidity is still hidden somewhere, but it doesn't run around, and finding money for companies remains a hard job, and lending still remains a very stiffy kind of activity. And here I think that in order to improve this side of the matter, let me say this for a second, Fred. I don't understand why they have not yet decided to test a conventional value for the troubled assets. Because they are blocked there. They are blocked there. We know that there are all of these troubled assets around. There are solutions envisaged, the bad bank, the sidecar in each bank where you put your troubled assets, etc. But all these solutions remain in the air and nobody dares to implement them because when the moment comes of saying, well, and therefore I have to buy these assets, What's the price? Nobody knows the price, for the reason I said before. But these were so crazy that they have, let's say, invaded the world with titles of unknown value. If the value is unknown, they will never find the solution. And if they never find the solution, the credit crunch will continue. And no economy will recover unless we lift up our public debts and we print money in unacceptable levels. Therefore, a value has to be set, which is not so far from zero. Otherwise, the taxpayer says, I'm going to buy these things that have no value, and not so close to zero. Otherwise, the undercapitalization of our banks would go to zero, and they would be, for other reasons, underrated to... it has to be found. Here, a coordinated decision, in my view, is needed. Here is where all of our finance ministers, in agreement with the banking system, should say it's a certain share of a benchmark. We take a benchmark and we say it's 30% of that thing. And therefore I buy for that value and you devaluate for that value. Otherwise we remain just where we are.
I would invite anyone who has a persuasive answer to that question to offer it. You get priority on the floor. Yes, the gentleman back there. No, right there. Yes.
Thank you very much. Andreas Billmeier with Ziff Brothers Investments. I'm a European transplanted in New York. And as such, the one question that I've gotten the most the last 3 months is, when is the euro going to break up? In a variety of variations, but always the same question. Now, 3 months ago, I was laughing. Now, I'm no longer laughing. I still tell people that ask that question, it's a political no-no, it's an economic no-no. But people have explained to me, look, think about a country where you have an opposition party that at some point takes a step and says, look, all the mess that we're in is due to the euro. And this party right now would do pretty well at elections. Now, what do I answer to people that come up with this scenario?
Well, you know, there are several nonsenses, and this is one of them. If there is a case, I mean, if somebody asks me, prices were much lower before the euro. Now with the euro, I spend much more. Is the euro responsible for it? I would find some difficulties in denying that there is a relationship between the euro and the new level of prices in several European countries. But if the argument is that this kind of crisis is due to the euro, no. I mean, it is so easy to say no. If you, I mean, for me, if you ask me whether it's my wife's fault, I said, no, my wife has nothing to do with this crisis. Also, the euro has nothing to do with this crisis. Not differently than my wife. I mean, there is the same distance, because it is correct that it comes from a basic economic imbalance between Asian and US economies, surplus and deficit. It is true that it comes from an excess of risk activities that were started off mostly in the US. It is true that it involves Europe in the sense that also our central banks accepted what should not have been accepted, in my view, by our banks, but the euro is completely innocent. The euro is completely innocent. I would say that Europe as such, somehow, is not a front stage player in all of this matter. And what Europe risks is to remain a secondary player also in the future. because assuming that there is a substantial agreement between Asian economies and the US in recreating an acceptable balance between their two subsystems, Europe might remain aside without any consequence, and therefore we could keep declining without anybody else paying the consequences of it but ourselves, and therefore it would be our own business only.
Ted?
Ted Truman here at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Very, as usual, thought-provoking remarks, deep. So I have this question when you were talking about, I'm not going to answer the question about how far above zero or below zero I am. I'm not smart enough. Other than to say I'm not in faith, think nationalization is a slogan, not a solution. And you're talking about the financial dimension of this crisis. You stressed that a lot of this was, you acutely blamed it on the Supreme Court. I thought that was interesting. I understand the point. But you said lots of the so-called innovation was made in America, but it was transferred to the rest of the world. And accepting that, so does it therefore follow, and one question would be, part of the first question is, well, it was transferred to everybody else because there was a race to the bottom. I mean, competitive forces said everybody had to do it because it was being done in America. And you had contagious competition and laxity, if you want to put it that way. And then the second question would be, going forward, does that mean that the minimum for the world is whatever we end up doing, trying to clean up what we perceive to be the mess, right? And that sets the minimum with respect to what's done in Europe, for example, or Japan, or other parts of the financial world. Or can you imagine, as has been brooded about in some European leaders, saying, well, we're going to have a tighter financial regulatory system in Europe, and the United States in particular, or everybody else for that matter, can go their own way?
No, this would be another nonsense, because if the fact that this thing was originated in the States is a fact. I mean, it's not contempt of the United States. It's a fact. Because financial activities are more sophisticated here, because there are more people thinking of these things, etc. The fact that it's spread all over is due to the fact that we are global nowadays. And of course we are even more global if the starting point is the US, for several reasons. Because why the IMF ignored the US in the years when the US deserved attention, that were the last ones? Well, I mean, in good faith, certainly in good faith, because the financial system of this country had always been the best and the most efficient. And therefore, I tend to take care of those who are well known not to be so efficient. But, I mean, this was... in a global system, therefore, having Europe with tighter regulations and somebody else, mostly the US, with looser regulations would be a disaster, because it wouldn't work anyway. Please, here I'm clear, and misunderstandings are not allowed. In this sector, better regulations are needed, and better regulations are not necessarily intrusive, are simply better than nothing. When I refer to these activities are too complex and technically difficult to be understood by the regulators, is something that I have read in decisions. I have not invented it. And shame on those who wrote it. because speaking of asymmetry of information between the regulated and the regulators in relation to really understanding what the device is something that, I'm not ready to accept. I was a regulator, and I understood what my regulated guys were doing.
Mr. Prime Minister, we could go on for a lot longer, but I'm afraid we're up against our closing time. I want to thank you very, very much for sharing your wisdom with us. We thank you for raising lots of questions and even offering a few answers. And we look forward to hosting you here again as this discussion continues, as it will. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.